First of all, I just really want to say sincerely thanks for everyone who's presented already. I've just found it so enriching to hear about all these different methods, and it's been very good for humility, just to see how much, the ability there is to look at these things, and hopefully you'll enjoy some of our approaches as well. But thank you. So let me introduce the team. I'm Christina Karns. I'm a cognitive, social, and affective neuroscientist in the psychology department at University of Oregon. And a couple collaborators I want to mention also in my department, Ulrich Mayer and Ryan Giuliano, a grad student. Gus Skorburg, my partner in crime today, is a doctoral student in philosophy. And my co-PI, Mark Alfano, originally at the University of Oregon and currently at University of Delft in the Netherlands. Thank goodness for technology, lots of Skyping. Oh, and he couldn't be here today because he's currently in Australia, but he's really disappointed that he has to miss it. So we'll try to keep to a structure because there's a lot we want to talk about. So we'll talk about the conceptual framework, deep integration, how we're going about that, in addition to progress update, obstacles, and those deliverables. Just to give you a preview of the methods that we'll be using, we'll be talking about brain waves, the heart, behavior, and philosophy. So all B's, biology, behavior, and books. Now the conceptual framework. So when we approached this project, we were interested in, as all of you are, the self-motivation and virtue. So let's start out with what kinds of questions we want to ask about the self. So we're all asking, who am I when we think about who we are as a self? What does that mean? Can we go a little deeper? One way to think about that is what you value, what's important to me. And we've definitely seen some work that is very interesting addressing this question. What actions do I take? Right? So you also have to look at how you actually behave in the world. What choices do you make? And what do you express to others? There's definitely a social signaling of the self that we do. And I think an important thing that's often overlooked is how your body actually responds to stimuli in the world. What are the automatic responses that occur? Does your heart rate increase? Maybe if you think about if you get on a plane, how does your body react when that person sits down next to you and is really ready to chat? Are you like, yeah, let's do this? Or you just like break out in a cold sweat and look for your headphones? And there's definitely a physiological response that goes along with that. And that is part of yourself. It's personality. It's also, do you value that conversation more than that time to yourself? So how about motivation? Really different question, right? What are your motivations? Why do you do the things you do? Well, here's what we realized when we dug into this question is it seems like the same questions are important for your motivation. What do you value? What's important to you? What actions do you take? What do you express to others, right? Why do you express those actions? And how does your body respond to your thoughts, perceptions, and actions? So those are all motivations, drives. How about virtue? This one a little different. The question is, do you do good things? And as my philosopher colleagues taught me, it has to be for the right reasons. Again, why do you do good things? What do you value? What's important to you? What actions do you take? And what do you express to others? And how does your body respond to your thoughts, perceptions, and actions? I think is another important component of virtue that might be overlooked sometimes. So maybe you're totally convinced of this. Maybe you're not sure. We're not sure either. Here's some issues with this approach. When you think about what you value, what's important to you, not all your preferences, not all your attitudes are virtuous. What actions do you take? Not all actions are virtuous, right? There's motivations that lead to actions that aren't virtuous. And we're constantly making trade-offs and compromises. There isn't always a clear right thing to do, right action to take, right way to express yourself. How your body responds. Not all bodily responses are motivating. Some are very unmotivating. And not all your drives are virtuous, even though they might have some sort of purpose, be goal-oriented. So that's where we kind of think that the philosophical approach has some things to add to kind of help answer these questions and talk about how conflicts between these domains might manifest when the answers to all these questions aren't the same answer. So how are we going to take an approach to measurement in a way to try to answer these questions? When we're talking about the answer to the self, what do I value? The measurement approach that we're taking is just an explicit report. And the approach we're using is questionnaires, not because it's the best approach. I would love to do 2-hour interviews with these participants, but it's a little bit outside the scope of this project. So for now, we're stuck with questionnaires. And questionnaires are convenient, and they're easy to administer, but they should definitely come with a warning label, because there's lots of problems with them, right? There's lots of problems. There's this idea that people are just going to report what's socially desirable. Issues with reliability, are they always going to report things the same way? And we're aware of these things, but we think that a reasonable first place to start is just to ask people what they value. And this is one controlled way that we can ask people what they value and get some numbers out. All right, so how do we measure this idea? What actions do you take? The second question. Choice behaviors. So we can assess what choices people make a number of different ways. One, we can just ask them, how do you behave in the world? How often do you do these things? So we're doing that. But we can also put them in a little rat maze or just sort of a constrained cognitive type of task and observe what kinds of choices they make, how long they take to make those choices. And last, how do you react? And we're taking 2 approaches to this question. Oops, I'm not on that slide. There we go. 2 approaches to how you react. One is to use implicit association tasks, or basically word sorting tasks, and you get a sense of how easily or automatically someone sorts words. And these are just sort of automatic ways of responding. They're influenced not by your explicit values per se, but just sort of the ease of sorting associations into things that are good or bad or associated with yourself or not. And I'll talk about that more a little later. And in this domain, too, of how you react, you could consider the physiological responses from the brain and from the heart as something that isn't necessarily controlled by your sort of conscious awareness. So if we're looking at something occurring in the brain at 200, 300 milliseconds, that's really fast. And so presumably this is reflecting something that isn't necessarily really deliberative, like the amount of time it might take to resolve a moral dilemma. So we're not the first one to kind of try to look at virtue with these different approaches, but what we're interested in doing and what we kind of found compelling about this initiative was the idea that maybe we need to use the strengths and weaknesses of each approach to look at something a little broader. And what we're thinking of is that people vary in the amount that these explicit, implicit, and choice actions are in alignment with each other. So we all have these competing drives at any moment. At what point do you sort of have an action where there's a lot of coherence between these different domains? Because all these things are part of us. They're in our body. And so what we think is that maybe a good construct to use is integrity. And we're thinking of integrity as sort of a drive. There's a movement there, there's a variability there, but a drive toward harmony among these explicit values, implicit values, and behavior. So when these things aren't in alignment, there's a little bit more physiological stress. There's sort of a sense that you have to respond to something in the environment. Maybe it's like a homeostatic drive towards consistency because it might take quite a lot of energy to kind of maintain these separate goals and motivations and try to resolve them. So sometimes you might resolve them by making the right choice. We're also aware that you might try to resolve them by changing an attitude. I behaved this way, therefore maybe I don't value this other thing as much as I thought I did. Okay, so that's how we're thinking about integrity. We've presented this a lot at our university, and usually the first question people come up is like, what do you mean integrity is sort of a drive toward harmony between these different things? Integrity is just being honest or trustworthy or upright in some way. That's integrity. Well, the only kind of strategy I have to address that is a call to authority. That's a good argument, right, in philosophy, call to authority. Okay, so here's the authority. It's it's Google. So I'm going to cite this in my papers. Okay, so Google says that integrity is the quality of being honest, yeah, but it's also having strong moral principles and moral uprightness. But it's the second definition, it's also the state of being whole and undivided. So I think there's a little bit of room out there for thinking of integrity as this state of being whole and undivided, and honesty might be just one way that integrity is expressed, right? So you might be honest when you tell your friend that he's gained a bit of weight, but maybe there's more integrity in not telling your friend that he's gained a bit of weight because you value his feelings or you value your relationship more than being honest, okay? So I think integrity has a little bit more to say than just honesty or uprightness. Now, in case you don't buy that Google is a good authority, you guys laughed at this. My feelings are hurt. No, in case you don't buy that, well, look at what Google has to say about philosophy. These are all the Google doodles that I could find for philosophy. And maybe with good hard work, some of you philosophers will have your own Google doodle someday, which is a good goal to have.
Google can't spell Confucius, but other than that, it's fine.
I can't spell Confucius.
I want to say that, Christina.
I will, yeah. I will fully admit spelling is not one of my virtues. I'm a little bit, I just don't spell. Bonus points if you find more spelling errors later. Nietzsche. Yeah. Oh, crap. I always do that. No. I am a really terrible speller, and this is how I build rapport with my students, is I give them extra points when they find spelling errors in my slides so that I can address them later. Yeah. Okay. I'm human. We all have our flaws. It's my only flaw, the spelling. Okay, so let's get to hypotheses and measures. So with this sort of big idea, there's a big problem, and that's this issue of scale. We have this sort of big idea about virtue. How are we going to actually test that? My training is, we narrow it down. So let's choose one virtue. We chose generosity as the virtue that we wanted to focus on, mainly because we want to use our strengths and start with what we know, but also generosity is sort of a universally accepted virtue, even though people vary in how much they themselves sort of identify with that virtue. We choose some measures, and we're going to innovate a little and borrow a lot because we don't want to reinvent the wheel, hopefully. And then we're going to make specific predictions about this very small world that we've created that doesn't really necessarily scale up to all of virtue. Now, that's the scientific solution.
And then from the philosophical side, and so we'll talk more about this kind of scale issue, but one thing that we're trying to be really committed to, and we'll talk more about this in the deep integration section, is for those of us on the theory side, right, the big picture side, to gain enough fluency in the measurements, right, and the methods that are used empirically to really try to understand how far are we warranted in extrapolating beyond the data, because we have this big scope of big questions, and philosophy at its worst extrapolates beyond the data. And so we're really trying to do our best to understand the limitations of each of the kind of ways we both come to approach the problem.
Okay, so that's what we wanted to put out there up front. Just getting back to the predictions for this project, one hypothesis that we're testing is that explicitly endorsed values should predict giving behavior, right? So we should be able to forge a link there. And we think that implicit associations should predict the automaticity of giving in a speeded task. So if these things are indexing the same thing, they should be related. And then last, in our embodied measures of autonomic stress and reward system processing in the brain, we think that this will reflect the interaction between these implicit and explicit measures of value or generosity as a virtue. Okay, so I'm going to give it to Gus to talk about how we've tried to do some integration.
Yeah. And so the first kind of way we came to this project, or one of the first ways, was thinking about, philosophers have theorized a lot about different virtues and values, and what way can we bring that theorizing, that thinking, that kind of intellectual labor to bear on like psychological instruments, and the way in which psychology uses questionnaires and measures in their tools. And so we talk a bit about this. We've done this with a philosophically informed generosity scale as well as a philosophically informed integrity scale. And then one of the things that's kind of ongoing that I guess maybe I didn't necessarily anticipate when we first started this project, though, is the degree to which having like a hands-on, as in like actually being in the lab, squirting gel in people's hair and like strapping brain hats on them, does change the way we think about the philosophical issues of virtue. And so getting a sort of hands-on knowledge of things like neuroimaging really does facilitate a different take on the philosophical questions and philosophical inquiry. And one of the things that Christina and I and Mark have noticed in our conversations is that we all sort of come to this project with these implicit ideas about how we're trained, and so one thing that Christina and I often talk about is that, when you're trained in cognitive neuroscience, the questions you ask are often very much framed by the sorts of things that you can measure. And those are sort of constrained by the measurement technologies that exist. So like what sorts of brain hats can we use? What sorts of electrodes do we have? And that's not something that those of us, and look, I'm guilty of this. When I first sort of started doing this empirically informed philosophy thing, that basically just meant reading discussion sections in papers, right? And being like, oh yeah, all those numbers and like electricity, magnets, whatever. And so getting a better sense of that sort of allowed me to understand what sorts of questions or what sorts of things are in the background for asking neuroscientific questions, and then vice versa. And so when you don't have training in these sort of empirical methods, that has its own set of problems for the kinds of questions that you can ask. And so one of the things that we've found both incredibly rewarding but also incredibly challenging is trying to sort of peel off like what sorts of implicit values and implicit ideas do we have about coming to these questions and kind of challenging each other on those. So in terms of deep integration, it doesn't get much deeper than philosophers with 71 electrodes hooked up to them. And this is what we do to all of our participants.
You forgot the 11 on the torso.
11 on the torso, 64 in the cap.
No, 71 on the cap.
71 on the cap. This is why we need each other. Right? So yeah, this was just like a quick shot we took of our lab with all the computers and wires that we hook our participants up to. And so, in addition to all these sort of like empirical challenges and stuff, it's also just really fun. I spend as much time this term in the lab squirting gel in people's hair and plugging in electrodes as I do working on my dissertation, much to the chagrin of some of my philosophy colleagues. But this stuff is fun. And so in addition to being important, it's just been a really fun and rewarding opportunity as well. And so in terms of the kind of like practical, what does the deep integration mean from day to day for us? Through this project, I guess the one thing I would say is that it's been rewarding on its own, but then it's also set up some kind of longer term projects. And so one thing that Christina and I have done is set up kind of a weekly reading group with ourselves and another graduate student in neuroscience. We call it the selfish group, the Psi for psychology, fish, philosophy. And that's sort of turned into an extension of the project we're working on here that our collaborator, Jordan Livingston, and I will take to Duke this summer for the summer seminar on neuroscience and philosophy, building on sort of the project we're doing as well as some of Nina and Sean's work on the moral self. And so just by virtue of us kind of talking about this, it's spawned these longer term projects. And additionally, the work we've been doing here will also kind of take that and expand it to the summer seminar back here at Notre Dame in a few weeks with many of the folks who are actually in the audience here, Darsha and Owen. And so that's kind of been the sort of short-term stuff. More long-term, one of the things we talked about in our grant application is a collaborative theory paper. And so because we've been so concerned with this issue of scale as we've talked about it, we think one of the most important contributions we can make is to sort of put our thoughts on paper about how it is that philosophers can philosophize when we're dealing with the level of like neural networks. And so how can we kind of scale that up to make it important and salient and answerable to philosophical questions? And so that paper's in progress. And then another exciting initiative University of Oregon is Christina, along with Mark Alfano, our co-PI, are developing a class for the Honors College on the philosophy and science of virtue. So we'll get the best and brightest at University of Oregon also thinking about some of these issues along with us. So with that said, we'll sort of start to update you on the progress that we've made, on the things that we've actually done, and some of the preliminary findings we have. So to kind of recall, we're interested in these three sort of areas. The interaction between them is kind of how we're thinking about integrity. And what we'll focus on today, the stuff we have the kind of preliminary results for, are all in the kind of explicit circle. And so that's what I'll talk about. So one of the things that got this project started was that Christina and some of her collaborators in the psychology department, through some of their work on charitable giving and generosity and gratitude, often used this principles of care survey from Wilhelm and Beckers, and kind of referred to it like almost offhandedly as like a Kantian norm. And then so Mark and I see this and we're like, wait a minute. Kantian norms, like maybe a little bit, but at best it's a mixed bag. And one of the things that we sort of noticed is that this item or these items and many others like them don't really get at what we might think of as a sort of Aristotelian virtue of what we're calling like fluent generosity, or the idea that we can, for example, give to charity and take pleasure in it, rather than having to overcome some internal struggle and do what we think's right because we're acting in accordance with some principle. And so one of the first things that stood out to us is the need for kind of more philosophically robust and philosophically informed account of generosity. So drawing on the work of Roberts and Wood's 2007 book, they had this really nice sort of robust definition of generosity. And so in kind of common parlance, generosity is usually like, oh yeah, give money to charity. But in this sort of more, just really wide-ranging, it's thought of more broadly, right? It's not just disposition to give money, but to give any valuable thing. So of course it includes goods, but also things like giving time, right? Giving attention, energy, giving credit, benefit of the doubt, like in arguments, and knowledge to other persons. And so starting with this kind of robust, philosophically informed notion of generosity, it led us to sort of develop a survey based on this philosophical idea. And so what we really wanted to emphasize here is not so much, this, overcoming the struggle to be generous, but rather things like enjoying giving to others, right? Taking pleasure in giving others your time or your, the benefit of the doubt. Doing things like, liking imagining what people do with the gifts that you give them. Or on the sort of reverse scored items, right? Finding it difficult to do these things or struggling when trying to do it. And so we hope to kind of capture something like this notion of fluent generosity with this survey. And so we'll talk more about some of the preliminary results we have here. But we think that something like the virtue of generosity is likely supported by like a wide range of values. So one of the things we've included that came up in another talk yesterday is that we'll also use the Schwartz Portrait Value Questionnaire. And what this allows us to do is to kind of get a sense of how these new philosophically informed measures kind of match up with some more well-established and cross-culturally validated surveys like Schwartz. And so, kind of a priori, we thought that our construct of fluent generosity would probably, be somewhere up here in Schwartz's portrait, what he calls this higher order value of self-transcendence, so to include things like benevolence and universalism. And so we do have some preliminary data to that effect, that what we're calling generosity does, sort of in here, up in here somewhere, and Christina will get to that in a minute. But the second component that we've sort of done in this vein is also developed an integrity questionnaire. So the same kind of method, right? What have philosophers said about integrity, and how can we kind of translate that into a psychological instrument? And so this, kind of beautifully matches up with the Google definition, right? This classic paper. And so one way to think about integrity is just that, like, it's being upright and honest and loyal. And oftentimes it seems that these are used kind of synonymously. But what seems to almost be in the background of that idea is that, to act with integrity is just to conform with the socially accepted code of morality. Things like keeping your promises, don't cheat, don't tell lies. And so when we think people talk about integrity, like there's probably some of that going on. But also, there's this other more complicated thing that we've started to think a lot about, that oftentimes what's meant by integrity is not just so much this blind adherence to social codes, but rather doing what you yourself think's right, regardless of whether it coincides with more conventional views. So it's kind of the standards that you have. And so we're sort of inspired in this regard by some of Peggy's work on whistleblowers, right? That this is like this would be a sort of good example of how looking at whistleblowers, it's not about sort of, adhering to the institutional or organizational values, but, doing what you yourself think's right. And so we wanted to be able to try to capture sort of both of those dimensions as well as some others. And so And looking through the philosophical literature on integrity, we came up with these 4 a priori dimensions. Something like consistence or coherency, which seems like kind of intuitive and obvious. So items like I find it easy or I find it difficult to act in accordance with my values. My own values and commitments often conflict with one another. And the thing to say about all these and our approach here is that the way we're talking about integrity, the way we want to study it is kind of value general. So we don't want to plug in specific values here, but it's just a question about how do you relate to your values in general, one of which might be generosity, one of which might be honesty, one of which might be curiosity, what have you, but that's a sort of approach. So one dimension of that is consistency or coherence. The second dimension we thought was something like motivation, so finding it easy to follow through on commitments, finding it difficult to stand up for what you believe in, sample items. Third, we also thought it would be important to have an expression component, that a person of integrity should be able to kind of clearly articulate what their values are. So items like, I thought a lot about what's important to me, or I find it difficult to express what's important to me. And lastly, this kind of social dimension, which gets at the second slide I showed, the ability to kind of easily distinguish between your own values and society's values, or things like your commitments to your friends often conflicting with those of your family. We think that sort of gets at that second kind of aspect that we talked about. And so I'll hand it over to Christina to talk about some of the preliminary results that we have from these 2 measures.
Okay, so we started out just doing kind of a short version of these questionnaires in a sample of university students, and then after we had a look at that, did a little bit broader survey in a sample of US adults on MTurk, as well as a second university sample. We feel like we're still just starting, but we wanted to have some numbers to show you. Okay, so the first thing we looked at is to what degree are these different potential domains of fluent generosity related to each other, and of course they are related to each other, but not so much so that we don't think that they might dissociate. We're still underpowered for a factor analysis, but that's the direction we plan to go. Same with these different domains of integrity. There was one where they seemed more tightly linked. I don't remember what that was. I didn't want to read too much into it at this level. But again, we have sort of a preliminary look that there might be some dissociations between these domains. But where we're at right now is just thinking about these as 2 different constructs, fluent generosity and integrity. And we were thinking about to what degree will this self-reported measure of integrity predict self-reported generous behaviors over and above these other types of values that we can assess. So I tried to make, I don't know, philosopher-friendly, was that the word Nina used? I don't know. But this is what we looked at. So first we plugged in this self-transcendence and looked at how it predicts fluent generosity. And then whatever is left over and unexplained, we wanted to see if we could explain with our integrity measure and/or the caring norms. And what we found was that the integrity measure did predict that residual variance in fluent generosity. And the caring norms, those more Kantian, and they were a little Kantian in flavor. Can I say that? Is that allowed? Okay. That one did not. So, this fluency in giving might be something that we're starting to get at. And then we thought, well, a lot of these generosity measures or the items in our generosity scale are about kind of this interpersonal fluency as well. So does that just relate to extroversion? And so in the second study, we included a personality survey, and extroversion was related to fluent generosity, agreeableness, and the other components were not. And self-transcendence, though, this sort of benevolence and universalism in terms of the portrait value questionnaire, were still related to fluent generosity, even with extroversion in the model. And integrity, again, had more to say. It did explain more of fluent generosity than just these other domains, while the caring norms did not. So I kind of feel like we're getting to the point where we might have some tools to assess these constructs that are a little bit more philosophically robust, but we're still in the early stages. Okay, so that's the data. And And now I just want to introduce you to the measures that we're using for these other two domains, although I won't be showing you preliminary data yet. I'm just not that brave. Want to wait till it's a little more fully baked. But for the implicit associations and automatic responses, how do I react? In our plan, this is starting to die, but can you guys still see the pointer? Okay. So here, in these behavioral measurements of implicit associations or automatic responses, we're using two different implicit association tasks, and we're also looking at the response times in our cognitive donation task. And then we're using two physiological measurements, ERPs and autonomic physiology. So the IATs that we're interested in is to what degree does a person associate these value words like generous or stingy or wasteful, you can tell a philosopher made this slide, with yourself versus other people. So if you're looking at yourself, there's Escher, one of my favorite artists. If you're looking at yourself, what kind of values do you associate with yourself implicitly versus when you look at other people? The second IAT that we're playing around with is just thinking about whether you associate words like reward, loss, penalty, and gain with charity or with yourself. And we do have a little preliminary evidence on this one because I was working on it before the grant started, that this can predict those response time measures in our cognitive task. IAT has a lot of problems, we're aware. And I think what we're seeing as sort of the most worrying problems is just that, I guess it's the scale issue again, is like maybe we can do some predictions in the lab in this one slice of time, but I think a weakness to this kind of time one approach is to what degree does it generalize to other situations? To what degree, so we can capture some individual variation in one moment in time, but as we saw in the keynote and in meta-analyses of IATs, those things do vary quite a lot over time. Okay, so the cognitive task. We'll make you guys wake up. So we're about halfway through. So wake up because you're going to have to do this task. Find your button box. It's on your table. I'm just kidding. Just use your little fingers. Okay, so use your fingers to respond left and right as you go through this task. Okay, so this is a task where you'll get real money paid in cash at the end of the experiment. I brought cash. Again, I'm just kidding. But some money goes to you and some is going to be donated in this task. I want to tell you about where we're going to donate the money. There's a local charity in Eugene, Oregon, a real charity. It's well known. They do a lot of outreach called Food for Lane County. And they have this diverse program of ways to deliver food to people, help them not be hungry. And real statistic, in our county, 1 in 4 children live in food insecure households. So I want you to wait while our computer program selects a child from our database to be the recipient of this donation. Okay, so we'll randomly select a child. Takes a minute, and then here's the child that you'll be helping today. This is Dakota. She's 3. Her mom is a single parent and works 2 jobs, and most days she doesn't get a full meal. This is not a real picture of a kid in Food for Lane County, but the statistic is. The name isn't, but this is a real person that they would be helping. So Dakota is going to be the recipient of the money donated during this task. So I'm going to give you each $10. There's already $10 in Dakota's account, and now you have to press some buttons to determine what's going to happen. So on each trial, there's a transfer applied to you or to Dakota, and whether this is a gain or a loss is going to be shown by the color. Green is a gain, red is a loss, and white is no change. So get ready with your buttons. What do you want to do? But you have to wait now. I tell them this, but there's going to be a circle that appears, and that's when you need to press your button. So circle appears. Did you press your button? So Dakota got some money on that trial. But sometimes you don't get to choose. So when there's a gap in the circle, I want you to press the button when there's the vertical gap, the one on the left, even if you don't really like what the outcome is going to be on that trial. So make your choice, circle appears, and so there you're sort of forced to press this button, and there's going to be no change to your account rather than a gain to Dakota's account. Here's another one. Circle appears, you get to choose. You guys all chose Dakota, right? Not everyone chooses Dakota. Here's a loss. You guys both lose. You have to penalize Dakota here, right? Otherwise, you get a large penalty to your account if you either respond too slowly, so we kind of force them to go quickly, or if you miss the target, you press the wrong circle. So what we find so far is that people who make generous choices, and this is preliminary data, review panel has seen already because we did it before the grant started, but people who make generous choices in these choice trials are making faster responses in those sort of forced response trials. So there's a link between their explicit choices in the task and the speeded response. So at the end of the experiment, 4 of the trials are selected, and there's a final outcome. You guys have 15 and Dakota has 10. How do you feel about these results? Positive to negative? How interested are you in Dakota's well-being? Do you kind of have a connection to this person or not? We ask a couple other questions about that. And then you have a final choice where you can choose one of 3 buttons. If you press this button, we'll flip a coin and we can move money from your account to Dakota's. So you kind of have a chance to write any discrepancy that you see. Tails, it'll just stay the same. We do this because we really don't want them to feel like we're monitoring their choices or we'll know what they chose at the end of the experiment, and that's true. We don't know until we look at the data later. Or you can press the right button and you can take money from Dakota's account and put it in yours. Or press enter to just leave the amounts as they are. So we get a sense of what they think is. Do you guys think anyone presses the right button? They do. Yeah, some do. Okay. So just getting back to the hypotheses, we've talked a little bit about these explicit, implicit values and how they might relate to each other. So what about these embodied measures? Again, no data. You shall see no data. That is mine for this part. We're still just beginning. But the main idea is that you might know or you might not know that here's sort of the brain's reward system. There are very definite projections out to your autonomic nervous system, both the sympathetic system, that's sort of your fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic system, which is like a brake on that. It modulates that fight or flight response, and it's involved in sort of pro-social and affiliative behaviors as well. And there's also feedback from the heart up into these reward systems. Now this pathway is quite a bit slower than brain waves, but there is a temporal component to it. Okay, so when we're thinking about this heart-brain interaction, we're thinking of the autonomic nervous systems working on quite a longer time scale than the brain measures. Okay, this is how we measure it. We put 11 electrodes on the torso. We measure EKG, and we measure impedance cardiography. And those, I took out that because it was too technical, but they assess basically parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system responses. So the overall prediction for this autonomic physiology is that when we manipulate the probabilities in that task where you're having to penalize the charity more often in one block than another, we think the generous person is going to have a little bit, they're going to have more physiological stress, a bit more maybe frustration or just like disappointment. And the ungenerous person is going to be not having that response. And then the same with the probability where we're manipulating, so it's a more, the outcome of that block is more favorable toward the charity. So we're looking at reward processing in the brain as well. And right around 200-300 milliseconds, there's a nice index of reward called the feedback-related negativity. And our idea here is that when we compare the feedback-related negativity to gains versus losses in charitable and uncharitable people, the charitable people aren't going to be distinguishing between those gains to self versus charity as much as the uncharitable person. So their brain rewards response is not going to be favoring rewards to gain. Yeah, I'll just skip ahead. So we think we're on the right track here, even though we haven't finished the data, because a cool paper just came out from Duke. And what they found is that if you split people into a selfish and altruistic group, the altruistic group, again, isn't distinguishing between charity and self, while the selfish group is. So I feel like we're on the right track. And they had a little bit different task and some different ways of determining who's selfish and altruistic. So I think we'll still have some stuff to contribute, but I feel like it might work. Yay. Okay. So overall progress summary. We've developed some philosophically informed integrity and generosity measures. We're testing them. We're piloting IATs, trying to get something we like. We're piloting the data in the lab. We're almost up to a dozen, but we are still, we need quite a bit more. And then I think real progress has been made in just this interdisciplinary learning that Gus and I and Mark have been doing. Training one philosopher to be an EEGer, though he needs at least 5 undergrad RAs to help him.
And then, I train one neuroscientist that can talk like a philosopher. I, however, don't get 5 undergrad RAs.
To help, you probably need 10. And so here where we're at in our timeline, you could just get the gestalt here, but we're sort of at this phase where our pilots are feeding into our in-lab testing, and we want to follow up on some of this pilot work with bigger samples. The analysis and processing is ongoing, and our model testing, we're going to wait till we have the full data set. And then here on the integration and dissemination side, we're continuing to develop this course together. I want to ask Will about your teaching that you mentioned, how you get those students to get that aha moment. That sounds really cool. And then we're working on a collaborative theory paper, continuing our reading and discussion groups, and hopefully not hopefully, we will have a nice publication collaboratively there. So obstacles, and we've kind of talked about this along the way, so I wanted to really talk about, for obstacles, the big one. This is the big obstacle. So I think a real challenge for philosophy is not extrapolating too far from the empirical findings beyond what the limitations of the methods are. There's always that kind of tension.
And then from the other side, it's, of course, from the philosophy side, is trying to keep tabs. And for me, it's often quite literally keeping in working memory the moral significance of what we're doing when we're looking at measurements and, averaged ERPs and feedback-related negativity and all this crazy complicated analysis and models and lab tasks, and really trying to sort of keep in mind that big picture and sort of what's at stake here in terms of virtue when we're doing the real nitty-gritty.
Right. And then for both of us, I think there's this continuing obstacle or continuing challenge to be really open to trying and failing at methods that are outside your area of expertise. Trying to bring in methods from even other domains of psychology to try to have something that's a little bit more predictive and scalable rather than your own little neuroeconomics task.
Now that one of us are personality psychologists.
Exactly, yeah, we're working on it. But this is, we think, the way to kind of make progress on some of these bigger questions. And so all of you are doing this, and it's been really inspiring. And these are sort of just the main deliverables. We'll have a data set, some papers, but more importantly, I think a real lasting collaboration. We have a good rapport, and we're hopeful that even after the project, we'll be making progress on these issues. Okay, so you guys have seen these enough, so I'm just going to skip it because more important is my gimmick. So this is. Have you guys seen the Powers of 10? How many of you have seen Powers of 10? Okay, good. So some of the room hasn't. It's like this old educational video from 1977 where they want to illustrate what it means to have a power of 10 each digit as you go through the powers of 10. And so now we're starting at 10 to the 14. This is distance. This is where philosophy is, right? Up here in the universe. And then this is where we get down to the neuroscience. Can you guys hear that? Not that it's important.
So we're still philosophizing.
10 to the 9th meters, 10 to the 8th, 7, 6,
That's where we are.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We are back at our starting point. We slow up at 1 meter, 10 to the 0 power.
So then we
Now
go.
we reduce the distance to our
Then we go like dive into his hand all the way down to genes and then quarks, and so it's hard to integrate these modes of thinking, but it's fun. So let's keep doing it. All right, thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, that was great. I'm just curious, could you say a little bit more about the relationship between integrity and generosity? At one point I thought they were just two different virtues, and then I thought maybe you're thinking of integrity as a kind of overarching or capstone virtue, but then you talked about integrity as a cause of generosity, so could you kind of sort that out?
Okay.
For
yeah,
me,
yeah.
I mean.
Yeah. So, is integrity its own virtue? I haven't been thinking of it that way. It's more like it's a drive. So it's a drive to link value and action. So the value being maybe like benevolence, or in the action being something like generosity. The virtue itself is more the action. And so in that model, it's not necessarily like we're saying it's a cause of generosity. It's just if you have integrity along with these other values, you're predicting generosity more than the value alone.
Yeah,
You want
so
to say
I think-
more about that?
Yeah, and just like, theoretically, so, Bernard Williams sort of says that like integrity is almost like not a moral commitment because it has to stand outside. It's like this thing that applies to a person as a whole. And I guess like maybe that's closer to where we're at. I mean, the thing that we think is interesting about it is that with this, we think about it as this kind of interaction term among implicit values, explicit values, and behavior, is that we can plug in other virtues and then sort of examine the degree to which people are integrated with respect to those virtues. So here, like, we just choose generosity, but I've been thinking, for example, about how something like curiosity might work in the same model, and that's sort of like 5-year project from now. But yeah, so it's kind of like this. I think of it almost as like a kind of second order way to look at these first order things like implicit values, explicit values, and behavior.
Just a quick technical question. The change in loss and gain in the EEG looks like a P3B change. Is
In
that
the paper?
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, so they actually, in their task, which is a little different, they found that the feedback-related negativity, which is more of an automatic response to gain and loss, wasn't what distinguished their groups, that it was later more of the P3A, which might relate more to, putting that into another zone of the brain.
So the first graph that you showed before their paper, is that your data or just
It was fake data.
fake data?
Yeah, like
Okay.
a model of what we expect to see. So we initially thought, yeah, it's going to be FRN, and maybe in our task we will see that. That's just one paper. But it's, so we'll look at both components.
So if it is P3B that's being affected, are you thinking this is related to working memory in terms of the integration of the decision process, and that there's an affective component related to the loss that's affecting the working memory?
Yeah, I think that would be a fair interpretation of their finding. Yeah, I'm not sure what we'll find yet.
None of this is my field, so I'm afraid these questions might be kind of basic. But doing the simulation, I keep thinking about this when I think about testing people's generosity. That for me now with this big fancy grant and all, giving Dakota $10, like I'll just write her a frickin' check. Who cares? It's very easy to be generous. Whereas myself in college, during the time when I had $10 a week for food, I might have I mean, would that make me less of a generous person if I actually needed some of the money and maybe wanted to split it with Dakota? And then I thought maybe the brain hat and all of that stuff, like, is that actually measuring the capacity for generosity when you don't, when you can't actually give everything you would want to give? Is that sort of how you mitigate the problem of
Right.
of making it seem like rich people are virtuous and poor people are greedy, right?
Right. Yeah. So to what degree can we sort of generalize outside of our little world that we create in our lab on Tuesday afternoon at 2? You know? Yeah, that's a really important question. So I think part of that is the explicit values themselves. And if you're a generous person and you really need lunch today, there is a conflict there. And so we think that that would elicit sort of more of a stress response. And in that moment, there is that less integration between those values. So I think it might be sort of a feature, not a bug, that there's going to be that variability between people. And whether or not it's SES or something like that, we do assess SES so that we can kind of use that as a covariate if we need to. But right, would I sort of condemn someone based on their, how they press those buttons? No. Yeah.
It's
But
really
it might,
interesting.
Yeah, it might help us kind of figure out how people make these decisions in real life.
Thank you for the talk. That was very interesting.
Okay. Hi.
Right. In one of the early slides, you speak about bodily responses motivating actions.
Mm-hmm.
And Damasio talks that way too.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never understood how that could work.
Yeah, I have something to say about that.
Okay, is it that the physiological response is uncomfortable and you want to get rid of it? That's what motivates the discomfort? Or that perhaps the physiological response is pleasant and you want to prolong it?
Right.
So how do you
the
think
way
about
that I think, a critique with Damasio's approach to sort of saying that the physiological response is directly sort of impacting like a decision in that moment is it's sort of like this response is really slow. And so the main critique has been like, you don't have time to kind of like be like, oh, I'm sweating, I must want to donate money or something. But the way I think of it is that these long-lasting kind of physiological states, they put you, they sort of prime you. It's part of the way that situations impact us. So most of the time, it's not that we only have 5 seconds to make a decision. We're sort of in a state, and decisions are coming at us while we're in that state. So that's why we're sort of analyzing it at this block level for the physiology, that you could be in kind of a state of tension or stress, and that's impacting your decisions overall.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
but how does that relate to Joshua's concern for actions being motivated by reasons? So is it that you could cite actually your physiological feelings as reasons for acting?
I don't think that's counterintuitive. I mean, like I'm trying to get it. What about like thinking about whether you're going to break up with someone or not? It could be like a long period of time where it's not sitting right. You just don't feel. You might not have like cognitive reasons. It's just not feeling right. So I think sometimes we do make decisions based on thinking about our bodies.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
But not generally, right? I mean, that wouldn't be a characteristic sort of moral reason for being, say giving to Dakota.
I'd probably disagree on that. That there might be individual variability in that, but I think there's a reason we have these metaphors like a gut feeling or giving from the heart. That there is an intuition around giving. Yeah.
I was going to say something else, but I'll also very quickly say that it's also, so Dan Batson has that paradigm on altruism, and it's often in context of generosity where, you can have empathic distress, so the motivation for the generous act is actually to relieve your own distress, and it is not other-centered. So that might be a case that fits into your sort of bodily motivation for giving. The question I had is actually about the implicit association of, let's say, the word generosity with the self.
Before, I don't have a great working memory. Can I address your first question first? Because
Oh,
I have
yeah.
something to say about that. So, as far as like motivating, like compassion or something like that to relieve your own distress, it's actually kind of interesting because the people that are the most distressed don't act.
That's not what Batson found.
There's a lot of work out there that says that this is the case. And then if you're relieved by the distress of someone else, that is other-centered. It doesn't have to be like that you're only being generous out of some sort of like
Well,
cognitive.
in Batson's paradigm, he found that when people who had empathic distress had an escape valve, they would take the escape valve and not help the other person.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Yeah.
I see. So how would that
If
be
you're
other-centered?
No. So
I must have misunderstood you.
if you said so, well, sorry if I misunderstood you, but you said that we relieve the suffering of others to reduce our own distress.
Some people do.
Okay. Fair. I think we could agree on that.
Yeah.
That there'd be individual.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that wasn't my question,
Okay,
actually.
yeah,
I
yeah.
just thought that would be a case of where someone might be acting more out of a bodily sense than out of a some kind of a rational
But if
deliberation.
if your body responds in a way that helps the suffering of others, that's a virtue.
Except that you are not reliably doing that. That's not a virtue,
Oh,
because
okay.
if
you don't,
you
if it
can have
doesn't
an escape
translate
valve,
to action.
no, it will. But if you're given the opportunity to do something else where you don't have to help them, you do something else.
Which is not virtuous.
Right. So that's what Batson found: is in cases of empathic distress, people in empathic distress will do something to relieve the distress of another person. But but he designed these studies very carefully and cleverly, so that if you can also give those same people an escape valve, and they will choose to escape. They will get out of the distress another way without helping the person. Whereas people who were what he thought were genuinely motivated altruistically would not take the escape valve, and they would go ahead and still engage in an altruistic action. So that just seemed to me a case where one person is probably being more deliberative and the other is reacting more immediately.
And
But
maybe
my
there's
question-
more coherence between value and action in
Yeah.
that person that helps than the one that escapes.
So unfortunately, that was all a distraction compared
I'm
to what I
sorry,
wanted
but
to
I love that
ask.
question. So.
Which is which is really quite simple in a way. In an implicit association of the word generosity with the self, seems to me could be very problematic. I certainly know a lot of people who would be very disappointed to know that they thought of themselves as generous, and they are very generous people, and they hold that as a virtue.
Yeah, that humility.
They hold as a
the
virtue
humility.
to not consider themselves generous, and they act very generously. So that would certainly be the case of a number of people in many traditions, but it would also be quite possibly the case with some people have come to that virtue independently. Maybe less in our culture than in other cultures,
Yeah.
but still, I
That
think
would
it
be
could
fascinating.
it could be a confound. So I don't really see. So why would there be a relationship between that kind of an implicit association, like I think I'm virtuous, and being virtuous?
I guess it's an empirical question. Boy, if I wanted to really address that, I'd love to, go to a Buddhist monastery and see if, the same thing holds there. Yeah, it's a cool question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it would be interesting. I think they wouldn't.
Yeah.